Tu attends quelque chose? Simplement dire son prénom.
Ah bon, c'est là-bas que ça va se passer?
Non, non, c'est ici, mais c'est la présentation d'abord officielle.
Et après, vous allez...
Après,
arrêter tout.
On arrête pour une minute pour que les gens qui vont parler, que ce soit
Ah
ici.
bon, alors,
soit...
d'accord,
Oui,
on commence.
On commence.
Est-ce qu'on peut commencer? Can we begin?
Chers collègues, c'est mon plaisir de vous accueillir à la deuxième session de notre réunion discutant la famine ukrainienne en 1933. Monsieur Pytlar va commencer maintenant.
The title of my paper is Reactions to the Famine 1932-33 in the Western Ukrainian Press. When looking through the pages of the Western Ukrainian periodicals at the time of the Great Ukrainian Famine of 1932-33, one may notice some rather surprising facts. Taking as an example the two most representative Ukrainian daily newspapers in the West, that is, beyond the borders of the URSS, the Dilo of Lviv in Galicia and Svoboda of Jersey City in USA, we must state that only a minuscule coverage was afforded to the Ukrainian social, cultural and political life under the Soviet domination, as compared with the volume of materials concerning Western Ukraine. And even those Soviet Ukrainian news that appeared were published in a rather haphazard, irregular and sometimes inconsistent ways. This might be only partly explained by the basic anti-communist tendency and a certain provincialism of the Western Ukrainian journalists and newspaper readers. The more important reason was the lack of availability of reliable sources of information about what was happening to the east of the Soviet border. Soviet press and information agencies were notoriously unreliable. Foreign correspondents were mostly confined to the Russian Federation and by force or by choice, and seldom ventured to such exotic countries as Ukraine. Private letters were subject to the GPU censorship. Tourist travel was limited in the extreme, and to cross Soviet border illegally was even more difficult in those times than to scale the famous Berlin Wall to the freedom today. All these matters applied in particular to the Western Ukrainian press reporting of the facts and circumstances of the greatest Ukrainian national catastrophe in the modern times, the famine of 1932-33. As we well know now, the famine reached its greatest intensity early in the year 1933. But in both above-mentioned daily newspapers, the fullest and most frequently published news reports and commentaries regarding the famine appeared in the middle of 1932, when the famine was only in its preparatory stage. There were still horses, dead horses to be eaten, and half-rotten beetroots to be dug out in the fields, and foreign correspondents were still allowed into the Ukrainian countryside, and some lucky people could have escaped the bullets of the GPU border guards while fleeing over the frozen Dniester River to Romania. Already on February the 15th, 1932, the Svoboda of Jersey City reported under the headline, "Moscow wants to starve to death Ukrainian peasants." Quote, "Pravda published an order to the Bolsheviks of Ukraine to fulfill the grain delivery in February. It appears that the Bolsheviks are exerting a renewed pressure on the Ukrainian peasants for the purpose of obtaining from them all the remaining grain not previously delivered to the state." Unquote. On May 25th, 1932, Svoboda published a special correspondence from Romania in which H. Porochivsky vividly described the horrors of the mass murder of hundreds of Ukrainian peasants trying to escape over the frozen Dniester river to Romania. He also quoted some statements of the few lucky ones who escaped the GPU bullet. Quote, "I fled to save myself from starvation." Quote, "I fled because my parents were taken away for not fulfilling the grain delivery." Unquote. Quote, "I fled for I did not want to be sent to the Luhovy concentration camp." Unquote. On June 19th, 1932, the Lviv Dilo quotes an opinion of the Neue Freie Presse correspondent Mr. Basekes. Quote, "A catastrophic famine is in progress in Ukraine." Unquote. And on the same date, Svoboda reports after Moscow correspondent of the Manchester Guardian. Quote, "The correspondent investigated the food situation in Ukraine, and from the facts established he deducts that the population there suffers from a grave food crisis." Unquote. On June 28th, 1932, the Dilo quotes a private letter from a Ukrainian worker now living in the Don region, that is beyond the borders of Ukraine in the Russian Federation. Quote, "Now in Ukraine, people are dying from starvation, many of them. We get letters from them. People have eaten up all the dead horses while they lasted. And from the North Caucasus, where I live, the Ukrainians soon will buy out all the corn flour. They are selling their last clothes and buying flour." So in those days, they still could buy flour in the Russian Federation. Later, it was forbidden. In the same number, Dilo quotes from a private letter from Ukraine. Quote, "We now have a horrible famine, and harvest was good last year. From our village, peasants had to deliver 40,000 poods. That's about 1,400 metric tons of grain to the state. Potatoes also had to be delivered. I still have food for only 1 month. What happens then, I don't know." Unquote. Dilo comments, "What is the cause of the famine in Ukraine? The most important cause is the system of the economic exploitation by the foreign power of the Russian Bolshevism in Ukraine. Starvation is the most reliable ally of the Russian occupation in Ukraine." And end of the quote. These Dilo comments strike us as very clear-minded and almost prophetic. Now that we know the full scope and the genocidal tendency of the Great Famine of 1933, and considering that these words were written at the early preparatory stage of the Ukrainian Holocaust. By the way, I don't think Holocaust must be complete. It could be partial too. If you burn 4 millions or starve to death 7 millions is still a Holocaust, although a partial one. On July 7, 1932, the Dilo comments under the headline "Famine." The Bolsheviks were shooting in vain thousands of Ukrainian refugees on the Dniester River in their effort to hide the truth about the horrible conditions in Ukraine. Today the whole world knows about the catastrophe of famine in Ukraine. German, French, English, American newspapers publish unanimous reports that this year's famine is not lesser than the one of 10 years ago, with the only difference that there was no drought last summer. Now that was definitely an understatement. As we know today, In 1921-22, famine, about 500,000 people died of starvation in Ukraine due to a drought in the southern steppe regions. In the famine of 1932-33, 6 to 7 millions died, and there was no drought. Also, in 1921-22, the Soviet government welcomed food relief from foreign countries, although even then, as stated by Mr. H. Fisher of the American Relief Administration, I quote, "The Soviet government not only tried to hide from the ARA what was happening in Ukraine, but also attempted to prevent any direct contacts between Ukraine and America." Unquote. During the Great Famine of 1932-33, the Moscow government did not admit any food relief actions from abroad and flatly denied there was any famine in Ukraine. On June 14, 1932, again, Svoboda reports after the Czech newspaper Večer, due to starvation, peasants are eating dogs and cats, and they desert their villages and flee to the cities. Kherson district lost about 1/2 of its population. Unquote. And on the following day, we read in the Svoboda a report based upon the official Soviet agency's information. Quote, "Stalin sent to Ukraine his most trusted helpers, the Prime Minister Molotov and the former Ukrainian Communist Party Secretary Kaganovich. Both of them have been authorized to carry out changes within the Communist Party of Ukraine. So even Moscow has now confirmed that there is now a catastrophic food situation in Ukraine." Unquote. On reading this news, one might be inclined to assume that Svoboda expected from Moscow a relief from the excessive zeal of the local Communist Party bosses. But as we know today, this was in fact the beginning of suppression of the local party's autonomous ambitions, which resulted in the virtual wiping out of 90% of the Ukrainian party leadership. The great genocidal famine could now begin without any local party's opposition. On August the 8th, 1932, the Dilo reported about quote, "the mass thievery of the kolkhoz harvest," unquote. I quote again, "To ensure law and order, the Bolshevik government issued an unheard of decree which stipulates death penalty or a minimum prison term of 10 years for stealing food," unquote. Dilo apparently did not expect that based on this law and order decree, thousands of starving Ukrainian peasants will be shot or deported for stealing some wheat ears from their own fields. On August the 11th, 1932, Dilo quotes some headlines from the leading British newspapers. Times of London. "Ukraine falls behind in the Soviet spring sowings." Belfast Telegraph. "Famine in Ukraine." Manchester Guardian. "Exports of Russian foodstuffs." Yes, while the Ukrainians starved, the products of their land and labor were exported to the Western world and consumed happily. And then, for months, while the famine in Ukraine intensified, while millions of Ukrainian peasants starved to death, you could search in vain in the Dilo pages for any news of the famine. The reason was simple. The Russian totalitarian empire started its business of genocide in earnest, and it tightened the lid on all sources of information. Foreign correspondents were not allowed into Ukraine. Borders were hermetically closed. Letters were stopped. And for the official Soviet papers, all was quiet and happy in Ukraine. To this must be added the new popular French tendency among European liberals seeking Soviet alliance against the German threat. As reported in Dilo, the great French liberal statesman Edouard Herriot, on returning from his celebrated Soviet trip, where he also visited Ukraine, wrote in the Paris newspaper L'Intransigeant, I quote, "All that disgusting and horrible campaign about the alleged famine in Ukraine is spread by Berlin with the purpose of horrifying the world using some 10 years old photographs," unquote. Thus spoke the great liberal humanist. In the meantime, Dilo published some rather innocuous news about Soviet Ukraine using the Soviet information sources, naturally not one word about famine. On August 12, 1932, about Soviet Ukrainian school manuals being in short supply. On August 27-28, a longish article about the construction of the Dnipro hydroelectric plant. On November the 14th, a rather peculiar comment about a virtual anti-Ukrainian pogrom then being carried out within the All-Ukrainian Academy of Sciences. Quote, "Increasing the academy personal staff by addition of some social and political elements has brought immediately some changes into its organizational system," unquote. On November 25, 1932, quote, "Jews are suffering from economic hardship in Ukraine," unquote. With all respect for our Jewish brethren, I never heard that any Jew ever died of starvation in those years. It was not until January 12, 1933, that Dilo published a short information about, quote, "food difficulties in the Soviet Union," unquote, based upon an official Soviet communique in Izvestia. On January 22, the Dilo quoted from the Stalin's declaration at the Soviet Communist Party's Central Committee session, quote, "Our party achieved a delivery of 1,200 million spuds of grain this year, as compared with 600 million spuds in the preceding year," unquote. No wonder Ukrainians were starving, but Dilo did not comment. On February 22, 1933, Dilo published a report about the Ukrainian Communist Party's changes based on Soviet information sources. Quote, "Party organization in Ukraine was not able to achieve its task in grain delivery. Postyshev has now been named secretary of the Ukrainian Party and the virtual dictator of Ukraine, with the task of the total reconstruction of the Bolshevik Party in Ukraine," unquote. Reconstruction means, naturally, shootings and deportations of the Ukrainian Party members, of course. But Dilo did not comment. On March the 3rd, 1933, the Dilo's Geneva correspondent, Mr. Danko, stated with a certain mischievous satisfaction, quote, "It is most unlikely that the Bolsheviks could get so much grain from Ukraine this year as they did in the last one," unquote. Only on May 21st, 1933, the Dilo published suddenly an alarming article under the headline, "From Our Tragedy Beyond the Zbruch." Zbruch was the western border of the Soviet Union. I quote, "Only seldom do we now get news from the other side of the Zbruch about the greatest tragedy ever experienced by the Ukrainian nation in the course of its 1,000 years long history. On the fertile Ukrainian soil there reigns today a horrible famine," unquote. And Dilo adds apologetically so as to explain its long period of silence. Quote, "There are now no personal contacts between our society captivity in Galicia and Volhynia, and our brethren in the Dnipro area, ceased completely those excursions of some of our people who once visited Soviet Ukraine on various occasions, meaning the leftist Western Ukrainians, who by then were either shot or disappointed. The only news we now get are from those living skeletons of people who managed somehow to cross the Soviet border, unquote. However, there were still some private letters which escaped in some miraculous way the GPU censorship and brought news to Western Ukraine about the horrors of the famine. These letters the dealer now started printing on its pages under the common heading, "From the land of misery and starvation." Finally, late in the fall 1933, the Ukrainians in the West, helped by some humanistically minded people of the world, started their organized reaction against the horrors of the famine. But it was then, after the harvest of 1933, that the famine, if not the starvation, was actually brought to its end. All those acts of protest have now been reported in the Dealer. On October 10, 1933, Dealer reports that the Norwegian Prime Minister, Mr. Mowinckel, acting in his capacity as the chairman of the League of Nations Assembly, was trying to put the matter of the famine in Ukraine on the Assembly's agenda. On meeting a refusal from the League's Secretary General, Mowinckel agreed to place this matter into the hands of the International Red Cross. That was the end of it. But on October 19th, Dilo published the sad news of the President Roosevelt's American recognition of the Soviet government. The coincidence of this date with the greatest genocidal crime of the Soviet government is truly remarkable. On October 23rd, the news was published about the killing of the Soviet Consular Secretary Manoilov by the young Ukrainian revolutionary Mykola Lemek in Lviv. Quote, "to protest the Soviet-Russian occupation and destruction of Ukraine," unquote. On October 28th, a report was published in the Dilo about the appeal of the Austrian Archbishop Cardinal Initzer on behalf of the victims of the famine, and also about the common pastoral letter in this matter by the 6 bishops of the Ukrainian Catholic Church. On October 29th, 1933, Dilo reported, quote, "the Ukrainian Social Committee of Rescue for Ukraine in Lviv designated October the 29th as a day of mourning and protest. The initiative of the Lviv Committee met with unanimous approval of the Committee of Aid to the Victims of Starvation in Prague, the Ukrainian Immigration Council in Paris, the United Ukrainian organizations in Brussels, and the Committee of Rescue for Ukraine in Chernivtsi, in Romania, now under Romanian rule. During the months of October and November 1933, numerous protest rallies took place in all cities and towns and many villages in Western Ukraine, and also in some Ukrainian settlements abroad in Europe and America. Most of those rallies were reported in the Dilo, and those American ones in the Svoboda. I'm finishing now. This organized reaction to the genocide of the famine was belated and not overly effective in a world preoccupied with the economic depression and the specter of the approaching war. However, it proved 2 undisputable facts. First, even the most efficient police and censorship system cannot prevent the truth of a great crime against humanity from finally leaking out. That is, unless you close your ears. 2. No artificial political boundaries, however securely guarded, can prevent a divided living nation from maintaining a unity of spirit and from a continuous striving to achieve a free, united, independent national statehood. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pytlar.